Welcome back to the show. We have Tony Gosling with us. I'll introduce him in just a few minutes. Mogden says, I love two-strokes. I do too. Especially the exhaust smell if you add a dash of Castrol R to the mix. Oh, Madrid says, I did 170 kilometers top speed. That's my next guest coughing with excitement about coming on. Try to control yourself, Tony.
From those two-strokes. Look, there are a couple of people who are big on motorbikes, aren't there? Yanis Varoufakis. He's one of those people that actually likes to get from venue to venue on his bike and his leathers. Another one, not quite so well known, is a guy called C. Wright Mills. A book in the 1950s as a sociologist called The Power Elite, which was for me was one of the best introductions to the way the world operates post-war. You know, after the setup of the CIA, etc., with the big business and the bankers really saying, well, why should we bother with democracy? We own a lot of stuff. Let's just do what we want to do with it. And so just trying to stick with your motorbike theme. And I love the Triumph Bonneville personally. I mean, I had some friends as youngsters. When we were at school, who had you could hear them coming about half a mile away, and a lovely sound too. So it sort of made the whole house gently sort of shake. But we are on to talk about the news.
Well,
just to let you've
introduced yourself. You've introduced yourself, and since you have done that, I'm going to stick with one more comment, which I like here. It's addictive, says Mogden, about the smell of two-strokes. There's a guy gets up to Newlands Corner near Guildford, that's in England, and he stands behind all the two-strokes that start up, bends down and takes in the fumes. I do love the smell of two-stroke. I actually, one time, Tony, I actually started a two-stroke motorcycle in my parents' house. I can tell you it takes about... In the house. It takes 15 seconds to fill the house with blue smoke. I had to stay at my friend's house that night. That was in 1982. I'll never forget my mum hollering out the window as I was leaving. She said, "You're trying to kill us." I wasn't, but I was very thoughtless because I didn't think it would start. I just rebuilt it, Tony, and it just had so much oil in there.
You should have been doing it in the garage, you naughty boy.
It was because it was cold and I was rebuilding the thing, and it was freezing winter, 1982 in Northern Ireland. But you're right, guilty as charged. So,
yes,
posthumously,
put some
sorry,
long johns. Put your long johns on and a jumper and get in the garage, boy.
It's too late now. I'm past that. I'm actually not past that now. I got a bike in the garage still, but I need to do something with the carburation. But you're right, Tony. You didn't come on to talk about motorcycling, though I'm impressed with your knowledge. The question is, what are you here for? Let's start with your journalistic background. Tell us about your roots.
Well, I got into journalism in the 1980s in London quite quickly after going to, it was a thing that was started by the GLC, Ken Livingstone, which was in Thamesmead, southeast London, which was a place that you could just kind of go in and learn a bit about radio. So I was doing it must have been nearly a year there when it got privatised. I was really fed up. So I just got onto the local BBC station, Greater London Radio, which I was quite an avid listener to anyway, and managed to get myself a job there as a researcher, which was not the easiest thing in the world. They're like gold dust, those sorts of jobs. But I got on over breakfast with the news editor. And quite a lot of people I work with there, it's funny how these things work. I hear them on Radio 4, they've got their own programs on the World Service now. Me, I just do my own little show here in Bristol. But it was a great way to get in because Greater London Radio was doing a lot of international stories. And when it was something awkward, they used to chuck it in my direction. And I'd usually get on the phones as a researcher. And I can always remember doing the stock exchange bomb. This would be in 1990, I think, and just getting on the phone. And I had a friend that worked nearby. So we had the first coverage, live coverage. Someone from the Royal Bank of Scotland, a couple of floors up from him. We got live. And this is the way that good radio can work. And it doesn't anymore, of course, at the BBC, is the guy I spoke to was really articulate. He was saying, "Oh, looks like there's been some sort of an incident. The police have just turned up." And so I said, "Just get him on the radio." We patched him straight through to the studio. And this chap from the Royal Bank of Scotland gave something like 20 minutes live coverage of the actual arrival of the police, the cordons. And he was just describing what was going on and answering all the sorts of questions that you might expect from one of the presenters. And that was the way it used to be done. And we took great sport in competing with people like LBC to get first to the stories. And so that's how I really got my start. Carried on in the BBC for about 4 years. When I got kind of elbowed out, and I'm not entirely sure exactly why, but my biggest suspicion is that it was to do with child sexual abuse in Salisbury, which I was looking into. And I didn't realise at the time, but Ted Heath, the former Prime Minister who lived there in Salisbury, was himself being accused behind the scenes at the time. But now, he wasn't into paedophilia. He was into abusing boys below the age of consent. So we're talking about sort of 13, 14-year-old boys. Heath was keen on.
That was the allegation. Yes, that was the allegation.
Well, Mike Veal,
used to be the allegation.
Constable, Mike Veal, who was the chief constable of Wiltshire Police, actually said, "Oh, Ted Heath was." This is to quote him directly, and he didn't last long in his job after he said it. 120% guilty of abusing young boys. So this is I think was one of the looking into child abuse in Salisbury when I was given the cold shoulder, the elbow, and they didn't renew my contract. I never really figured out why at the time, but I'm a little bit closer to understanding it now, I think.
The interesting thing about this was it rumbled on when I was a member of Parliament, in fact, for a long time about Ted Heath. And technically he was never tried and never formally charged, I think, ever. I can't remember if he was brought in for questioning or not. But I heard those rumours too. And let's use that as a springboard to understanding what you see your purpose in broadcasting to be about. Is it to report news? Is it to expose things that people would rather not hear about? To be precise, expose things that people don't want you to hear about.
A lot of what I deal with on my weekly programme in Bristol is miscarriages of justice. That's one of the. I mean, we're dealing with the local news here in Bristol. We're doing national news and we're doing international news. So this is one of my little bugbears is that, say, if you go to Germany, for example, you'll find lots of, almost all the large regional cities have got their own national and international newspaper, which deals with everything. In Britain, everything is so focused in London, a bit of course, in Glasgow and Edinburgh too, and a tiny bit in Cardiff. But everything is so centred around London. It really annoys me. And Bristol, we were a source of all sorts of fascinating news. We're the first city in Britain to get rid of our mayor. There was a referendum a couple of years ago, or last year, I think it was, that where the people of Bristol decided we've had enough of this mayor system. We're going back to the old committee system. And also, of course, historically, we were a massively important, the second city really in the country. So that's one of the things. But that is to look at local, national and international news on the same spot, which we do every week. But miscarriages of justice are very important, and just general political trends. As far as I'm concerned, anything goes. A lot of it is stuff that is simply not being dealt with by the mainstream at all, or being covered up by the mainstream. So, for example, in last week's programme, we were looking at the so-called Hampstead child sex abuse / paedophile case, where there's been a couple of there's been a Channel 4 documentary over the last 10 days or so. Plus, there's also been lots of articles again about this. And yet none of them have approached the Mackenzie friend or the legal advisor to the mother who initially reported this abuse to the police. They've just called her an evil troll, this sort of thing. They haven't given her a right to reply at all. Now, I'm not trying to say that I know what happened in this case and that the court was wrong. What I am annoyed about is the way that the coverage of it has been so utterly one-sided. Just literally not giving. A woman's name's Sabine McNeil. She was sent to prison for 4 years for trying to help the woman in Hampstead who had initially reported to the police that her children were being abused. So I just want to hear both sides of these things. And I'm quite aware that there is a massive attempt in the London press to suppress stories to do with satanic ritual abuse, particularly. And it's the sort of thing that maybe back in the 1960s you could have gone to Private Eye with, and they would maybe have published. But even these so-called alternative news sources now, almost every single one of them is absolutely adamant that this satanic ritual abuse does not exist. Well, let me tell you, I believe it does exist, and it's a way of traumatizing children. And one of the main purposes of these sorts of paedophile rings actually is blackmail, I believe. So to suck people into them and then to blackmail them, the sort of thing we saw Epstein up to. But, potentially this sort of thing was going on in London too.
You're describing closed community in a sense that protects itself. When I was a member of Parliament, I was well aware of these sorts of accusations, and the lists normally involved people by name, some of whom are still active in politics. The question I have for you, though, is whether these people go into politics to protect themselves, if indeed they're guilty of these things, or whether they become that way because power corrupts.
Look, I think that to a large extent, the people look at who the people Epstein targeted. They're people who are very influential, what you might call opinion formers, etc. And the idea is to compromise them. So, what's happened with Prince Andrew, really, he is, you have to be quite careful about how I phrase this, but he's alleged to have had sex with this woman who does look to be rather close to being a prostitute. She's being held there. She knows, I think, what she's being held for. She was overage. So this is the message that's sent out to everybody that ever visited the Epstein Island and is on the hard drives that he recorded there, is that if you step out of line, you're going to end up like Prince Andrew. Now, this also has another effect, which is to spin him out of any kind of credibility from the royal family in a similar way to Harry has been spun out. But I believe that there is a political, actually at the bottom of it, it's not so much a perversion motive. It's more to do with the politics of what can be gained, as we saw with Jimmy Savile, for example, what can be gained through having these kinds of things going on. And that is largely, I think, an intelligence source for blackmail. That is to say, once a politician is in power, they can then come up and say, hey, we got some photos of you, look, and then that person is utterly compromised forever. And they, of course, what they'll do is they'll say, well, actually there is quite a gang of us here. And so we're living, I think now, almost in a kind of mafia state. I've been looking at the Bilderbergers over the years, ever since the 1990s. And they are effectively a kind of shadow government for Europe and the United States, where what they do is they try to select the politicians. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, maybe that wasn't quite so easy. But I think nowadays almost every politician in the West has been through their process. And of course, if they start to think for themselves and to speak out, and they're quite close to the very top of power, like someone like John Smith did back in the 1990s. He was very against the Bilderbergers, even though he was the leader of the Labour Party. Then accidents can happen. And I think that's really a kind of mafia state that we've got effectively now in most of Europe, due to the efforts of the Bilderbergers, which were, by the way, initially funded by the Central Intelligence Agency and cooked up by the Council on Foreign Relations in the middle of the Second World War, when they thought they were going to win the war, but they wanted to control the political outcome in Europe. So these people think very, very far ahead, and I try and keep on their tracks, Lembit.
Let's come back to in just a minute. Just to be clear, I think that the Epstein, the woman you're talking about, would have been overage in this country, but I think there may be some different rule in where the island is. I'm not sure, and I won't have time to check that up while we're on air.
Absolutely, but then Andrew was too, so that's the power that these rings have to suck people in and toxify everything. And that's why I think the intelligence services, we had the Kincora Boys Home over in Northern Ireland as well, which was another one of these sorts of things. So, I don't want to get you into any hot water legally, but the point is that Andrew, I see him as somebody who has been, is a very public figure, and he's been hung out to dry. But the actual real message is to other people on that list: step out of line, and the same is going to happen to you, Sonny Jim.
Let's come back to you in just a moment. You're listening to Lembit Opik show here on today's News Talk. We'll see you in a minute.
Lembit Opik. This is the Lembit Opik show on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome back to today's News Talk. 35 minutes to go of the show with me, Lembit Opik. I'm still with Tony Gosling. We'll go back to him in a minute. You people love motorbikes. You're talking about something called the Yamaha RD 500. It's a remarkable motorcycle, I have to tell you. You seem to like something called a two-stroke as well. I have to say, I've always been nostalgic for this kind of device. Looks like lots of you have ridden bikes. Where are they now? That's the question. In terms of what we've been discussing with Tony Gosling, let me read you some comments. Holly says, I think most politicians, judges, celebrities are compromised in some way. The security services must have a very big file on so many people. And others seem to agree as well. A lot of Brill Camden has some comments as well. Quite complicated observation about toxins, in fact. Do keep your calls and comments here. Just a Bloke says, I reckon there are hardly any folks in authority who didn't have skeletons in their cupboards. Indeed, I wouldn't be surprised if that isn't one of the qualifications for being there. And in these days of deep fakes, Mingaling says, sad so many souls are compromised. Ollie says, sad they just can't be honest and respectful. Tony, I want to talk about this in this section of the show. Nobody I know is perfect, and everyone's got skeletons. Is there a danger that things which really may be interesting but aren't important are stopping good people from going into politics? So we just get the vanilla sky, nobody's in now. People who haven't done anything, have no skeletons, and really have no life experience.
Well, no, I think there is a battle going on really amongst people who are in politics, if that's specifically what we're talking about here. I mean, for example, in Britain, we've now got George Galloway as an MP. He's managed to get in without too much difficulty in Rochdale. So there, I mean, my experience of interviewing politicians and yours, I would imagine, socialising more with politicians, Lembit, is my experience is that you get a whole spectrum. You get a lot of people who are very, very decent, but they're almost like self-censoring because they realise, well, actually, maybe we can't achieve so much here. And the shadow that big business casts over the whole political arena is so awful with the the funding and lobbying of politicians. So you get politicians who say the right thing for the big business people. They will get mass. I mean, we've seen this, the Stephen Hester wanting to shoot Diane Abbott here in Britain, a big scandal last week. I mean, he's given the Conservative Party £15 million, but he's actually built up through dodgy government contracts a £1 billion company doing patient records, IT patient records. So this is the way it works. And that sort of thing, of course, should never, ever be allowed. Somebody that's got government contracts is obviously the government. If they're paying a particular political party, then that is going to simply help persuade the relevant departments and the relevant politicians to keep that person's contracts nice and sweet, because they know that some of that money is going to be coming back to them. So I really think it's not totally bleak because there are some decent politicians in there. But the way things are going, particularly the people that the press laud and scrutinise, they tend to be the ones that the rich and powerful rather than the other way round. So, I mean, I used to do reporting actually for RT. I did about 5 years on RT before it was banned as well, doing all these kind of cutting edge news stories. And, I would try and incisively look at every specific, say, a politician. I mean, for example, there was a politician murdered over in Russia. If you looked a little bit closer at the guy, you could see that he was a a pro-EU, pro-Western politician. But he'd been very, it's important to understand what he'd been doing is saying there should be no foreign money supporting politicians like me, because he'd been offered money by the West and he was absolutely dead against it. I want to be pro-EU, but I'm not going to be funded by them. So about a week after he publicly said that on some TV show in Russia, he was shot dead. So if you look into what's really going on behind the scenes, I mean, the motive for that seems to me to be that they don't want people speaking out like that. They want to have pro-EU politicians in Russia. This is back in, I think it was about 2008 maybe 2014, 2013. they don't want to have this discussion on the airwaves in Russia at all, that some of these pro-EU politicians might take money from the West, because, of course, many of them were. And he was exceptional. He was speaking out against it. So, I think it's very complex. Everyone wants to try and make this stuff simple, Lembit, but actually it's much more complicated than that. And I'd also, if we can, I'd like to talk a little bit about this attack on Russia before we finish, because this is all just kind of breaking, and there's loads of stuff going on the Ukraine-Russia front.
Yeah, I'll come to that in just a minute. In relation to what you're saying, what I find interesting is that narratives are established and people are judged by media in collusion with the authorities to be found innocent or guilty. One example is the unquestioning deification of Greta Thunberg, who seems to know virtually nothing about climate science, but was made to be a saint who couldn't be touched and couldn't be criticized. At the same time, other people who questioned it became outcasts, like David Bellamy, who said that it wasn't a problem and the human beings were changing climate. So even on something like that, where there's a huge amount of financial vested interest at stake with these relatively uneconomic renewable systems, even that has ended up causing this kind of behavior. You talk now about Russia. Two things there. What do you make of the way that this attack, with I think over 130 people were killed in Moscow, is being reported? I feel that if it happened in London or America, there would have been a whole lot more enthusiasm for reporting this tragedy. It has been reported, but I feel that there's a certain caution to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's 133 confirmed dead. Obviously, this is a soft target. 4 individuals are gotten into there. I mean, it is particularly horrific. And if you look at the motives here, also it happened around this Russian election. It's just about a week or so after, and to do with the Russian veto down in the Gaza horrors, the genocide down there. But it's, I think, important to understand that the Russian authorities have nabbed these people on heading back to Ukraine. And it seems pretty obvious to me, and of ISIS claiming this, that ISIS is very closely linked to NATO. NATO in Afghanistan, back in the 1980s, created this thing called Operation Cyclone, mainly the CIA, where they were creating these radical Islamic groups to fight the Russians in Afghanistan when the Russians after the Russian invasion. And so this whole thing of the Salafist style, like the Al-Qaeda, etc., radical Islamic maniacs, is a US NATO tool. And this, of course, was used against Assad of Syria too. And they're still there, some of these fighters, but it's basically a proxy army that the West has been using. And I think it's Dilyana Katacheva did some of the best work. I think is a Romanian or Bulgarian journalist, in actually tracking arms supplies from the United States to ISIS. We, on our show, tracked also Shamima Begum and her 2 friends from Bethnal Green, who were groomed on Facebook and sent to ISIS from Britain. And that was actually done by someone from the Canadian intelligence services. So you can, I mean, folks can look this up if they want to, but this is the Five Eyes. This is a Five Eyes NATO operation, ISIS. So the idea that it's ISIS.
So what do you mean by Five Eyes? What do you mean by Five Eyes?
Well, the Five Eyes. Okay, the Five Eyes. Australia gets a mention here. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, and Britain. The Five Eyes intelligence services. I always find that a strange kind of term for it, because each of those countries should have 2 eyes, not one. It's almost like each country has got 1 eye in its forehead. Yeah. It's a bit weird. But the Five Eyes is the key Anglo-Zionist. And of course, the other thing is, many people have told me over the years, is actually it's 6 eyes, because the Mossad and the Israelis are in there too, though they're never mentioned officially. So anyway, that's what it seems to me. It's just a NATO operation, and we've seen, which has almost been kind of lost this morning as well, 2 of these massive Russian assault ships have been sank in the Black Sea Fleet. Is something like 2/3 of the Black Sea Fleet has now been destroyed. by these Storm Shadow missiles, which are EU missiles, and the Ukrainians don't have the skills to shoot them, to fire them. These have to be being used by, actually shot at the Russian Black Sea Fleet by NATO personnel of some sort. So NATO is destroying the Black Sea Fleet under cover of the Ukraine war. So the Russians are not going to be very happy. If we see a British or other NATO ship go down in the next few weeks or days or hours, then don't be too surprised, because the Russians know exactly what's going on. The other thing is that it's the US and the NATO satellites that they're using to target these things, because they can't see Sevastopol from Ukraine. So the targeting is being done by the National Security Agency and GCHQ satellite network. So this is really turning into a NATO-Russian war, is what I'm trying to say. And of course, this is a horrific, cowardly act, but at least the Russians have managed to nab these 4 shooters alive, so they'll be able to interrogate them. That I would suggest the Russians will do a much more soft interrogation than you might expect, and we will probably at some time be finding out exactly who they are and who told them to do what they did.
If we were to look at the general mood of where the West is at the moment, some say that the West is actually in some kind of crisis because they've lost in Afghanistan. They've lost control over Iraq due to what I believe to be the ludicrous, self-harming, fake climate change scam, climate emergency scam. We're handing the keys of the economy to India, Russia, and China. Is it possible that what we're doing without necessarily feeling it is living in the end of empire, or at least a shift?
Well, most definitely. East? I mean, yeah, the plates have shifted, and every time we see some sort of event like the British Prime Minister, the British King, and the US President supporting the Israelis in Gaza, this actually just you can just see the credibility falling away and the respect falling away from the West. But it's not just that, is it? It's the trade war, if you can call it a war. Of course it is. It's very serious between East and West, between China and the United States, if you want to polarize it that way. The Chinese have won. They're winning. And what's happened is that living costs have been so high. Things like rents, mortgages, electricity, fuel, all that sort of thing, travel in the West are becoming so high that it's a no-brainer. Of course, you're going to get much cheaper materials manufactured in places like China and elsewhere. So we've basically, by the rentier economy we've got in the West here, where people who do nothing just own your property, the banks, maybe the landlord, etc., make so much, the money is being made by them, far too much, that we've priced ourselves out of the international markets. And that's, there's the Tory landlord classes, I think of, that what they've done is, as the manufacturing has gone, which happened really after the Thatcher era and the getting rid of exchange controls, as industry has gone, so the people who want to make money can really only do it from taxing our infrastructure, housing, whatever it is, water. And so this is this, and also it means that there's less democracy, because as we vote, the government and Parliament doesn't control the infrastructure anymore. It's all been privatized. Yes, so you're absolutely right. It's the end of empire, and in a way, that's what you expect from an empire that's falling apart. Is that it starts to turn outwards rather than to look at itself and say we've done this wrong in a psychological way. They don't want to. But I mean, Gaza is, I think, become an absolute totemic example of how the West is now on the wrong side of history, whereas we were on the right side of history back in the Second World War. And it seems to me that we're going to get some sort of horrific massacre over Easter, turning the Holy Land into hell, it seems. This is this threatened attack on Rafah by the Israelis. And they're even now saying, this far-right government in Israel, that we don't care what the Americans say anymore. We're going to do it anyway. And so this is absolutely one of the most, I think, deliberately horrific. It's a land grab, but that to me spells out exactly why the West is going down the drain. And unless we can managed to alter policies, like have happened apparently within the British Labour Party. They're now supporting the ceasefire. Then I'm afraid this is just going to go from bad to worse. We need to really root out the evil there is within our politics, the selfishness and the narcissism, the failure to recognise the faults and to actually put us on the right course. You know what it's called? I don't know if you've come across this term, accelerationism, but I think it's quite important.
What's it mean?
Well, what it means is accelerating the crises. So, we get something like COVID comes along, which seems to me was cooked up between the Pentagon and the Chinese in Wuhan. And the so-called solution is, what is it? It's this gene therapy, the jab, which is actually in many ways, or many people would argue, making things worse. So that's accelerationism. And Ukraine is too. So what we had nearly a peace deal a month or so after the Russian invasion. And Boris Johnson goes over there and says, no, don't have the peace deal, when he was still Prime Minister, and scuppers the peace deal in April 2022. Thinking in the back of his mind, well, hang on, we could sell loads and loads and loads of our military equipment here, as they've been selling these Storm Shadow missiles, which have been destroying the Russian ships, etc. And so it's very cynical that a crisis in Ukraine was then turned into something, the so-called solution is even worse. That's accelerationism. It's a Nietzschean philosophy. And bizarrely, the father of accelerationism, I mean, there's loads of other examples. You can think of the migrants and Rwanda here in the UK being a so-called solution. Outsourcing your problem to Rwanda is never going to work. Bizarrely, it was one of my old school friends back in southeast London in the 1970s, Nick Land, who is the father of accelerationism. He's now he went to Warwick as a philosophy professor, and he's now living over in Shanghai in China. But I think we need to understand there's both a philosophy and an operational arm of this, and people like Peter Thiel Eric Schmidt, all these tech giant rulers, Zuckerberg, they all seem to be absolutely wedded into that idea of you create as big a crisis as possible, and then you capitalize on it, you make money out of it. And that's a pretty crazy place for the world to go.
Hold that thought. We'll come back to we've seen the problems now. Let's talk about the solutions in a minute. Yeah. I've got Tony Gosling to the top of the hour. Let's try and stay on an optimistic, or finish on an optimistic note, an honest one, but an optimistic one. I'm Lembit. Do keep your calls and comments coming. This is today's News Talk TNT.
Lembit, Opik. This is the Lembit Opik Show on today's News Talk TNT Radio.
Welcome back, one and all. Lembit Opik here, just for a quarter of an hour to go. Still with Tony Gosling. We've talked about the problems around the world, the extent to which there's been, let me paraphrase it like this, self-serving activity by those people who are meant to be our servants, not our rulers. I always remind us of this. We pay their salaries. They work for us, but they don't feel like that some of the time. We've talked about wars. We've talked about conflicts. We've talked about suppression, oppression. We've actually talked about the perversion of justice in the United Kingdom and beyond. But let's see if we can end on a positive note. Tony, we know the issues, or at least we've discussed the issues. If you were made Prime Minister, it'd be interesting to see you as Prime Minister for, say, 5 years. What would be your agenda? How would you try to set things right?
Well, I think it's pretty simple, actually. I mean, Britain was the first country to go for mass urbanisation through enclosure, kicking people off the land and forcing them really to work in factories. And we've never really recovered from that. I think we've got these massive cities, particularly in the north of England, which have just lost their purpose to be there. Big industrial centres like Sheffield, Leeds, Manchester, there isn't, and the industry's almost disappeared from these places. So to me, it's a very simple thing. You've got to redistribute land. You've got to make sure that everybody has got their, whatever it is, a quarter of an acre plot. I think also undermining this reliance on rent and mortgages. Let's just get rid of that. If everybody has a right to a home, as they're supposed to have, in the UN Charter of Human Rights, people are supposed to have a home. That doesn't mean to say you've got to pay someone else for your home. I think everyone deserves a home. We had it in the 1970s. I worked with a housing association I was on the board of here in the Bristol area. And Stella, who was one of the former chairs of it, she said, I came into the housing associations because in the 1970s, we built enough public housing for everybody in the country and everyone had somewhere to live. So I think this sorting out the so-called housing crisis would be relatively simple, really. You've just got to make sure that everybody has got a right to a home. Every family has got a right to a home, that they're not having to pay some enormous inflated fee to a bank or a mortgage company or a fat cat landlord for. And so once I think you've addressed the main issue of land, then obviously money is another one. So we need to see money as a public utility, which should be there controlled for the public good. We don't want people controlling the financial system who are doing it for their own personal gain, as you've seen in Britain here. We've got one of the most horrific inequalities of wealth in the world. In fact, Rishi Sunak, I saw, gave, I think it was one of his sons, a several £1 million gift, managed to do it tax-free. And this is the sort of thing which is really extremely toxic. It's like, you know what it reminds me of? It's like a kind of medieval king we've got rather than a prime minister. These people seem to be way above the law and to be able to sort of make the laws to suit themselves. I mean, the press obviously is a part of all of this change I'd like to see, is a much more, the sort of thing that I do here in Bristol, which is to have regional, privately owned or maybe BBC style public press. But the main problem here is we've just had a survey in the Press Gazette, which is the journalists' newspaper here in Britain, that says only 2 companies now own almost all of the print media in Britain. And also not only that, you've got 30% of British people say they now trust the media. We are the bottom of the list of the 25 most advanced countries in Europe and the United States. I think they are OECD countries, roughly the OECD countries. So we're the bottom of the list. So the press is obviously getting it wrong. But the way they're trying to sort it out, Lembit, is by having these kind of fact-checking organisations, BBC Verify. Actually, no, we got it right. We didn't get it wrong. And so rather than actually address the fundamental problem, which is that the public don't trust the editors, the managers, they might trust individual journalists, but the people that are running the press, we're trying to paper over the cracks with these programs that say, actually, no, we are telling you the truth, really. And of course, the public don't fall for that propaganda. So those are, in a nutshell, those are the sorts of things. The redistribution of land, I think we need to just make sure that people have got a safe and secure home. And it's very nice of you to offer me the job of Prime Minister. And that's the sort of program I'd like to. That's the sort of program I'd like to see, just to take the weight off individuals so that they can actually choose what to do with their lives. And they're not forced and coerced into some horrific job that they spend most of the time hating their boss, but trying to smile and be nice to them. You know, that's the wrong way to run a society, isn't it?
I'd rather you were the Prime Minister than me. I could come and visit you, but I'm not sure I'd really want the job. Having been a member of Parliament, I don't think I'd want to go back in there. I wouldn't
last very long, I can tell you that. They'd have a coup against me, I'm sure.
Well, you're talking about a revolution, to sound like the Beatles, I think. They say you want a revolution. Well, you better get it right this time. The whole thing about property, though, you're turning British tradition on its head.
No.
Whereas in places like Germany...
So.
Well, yeah, in places like Germany, what you said wouldn't even be revolutionary. People just don't become mortgage slaves. They don't expect to own their property, a lot of them. Whereas in this country, it's this great attainment, this great ambition to have your own property, even though all that means is you give something to somebody else when you die.
Look, I totally disagree, because Germans have got used to this idea of own nothing and be happy, haven't they? The World Economic Forum agenda, where they don't even expect to have somewhere to live that's their own. Look, if someone else owns it, then you can be evicted. We don't want that threat of eviction hanging over anybody, because we want once you've got a secure home, you look after it. we're not talking about owning vast property empires. We're talking about owning your whatever it happens to be, tiny little eighth of an acre, maybe even less than that, but your own home. And actually, over the years, since the Norman invasion here, with the home owning democracy we've had in Britain since the Second World War, lots and lots of people buying reasonably cheap houses. Kevin Carhill wrote a book called Who Owns Britain. He's an old friend of mine. He used to work on the Sunday Times Rich List, and he was looking at the land holdings, the secret land holdings of the rich in Britain. He explained that we've now got the bigger, well, they're taking it away at the moment, but we've up until around about 2010, we had the largest land ownership distribution of people we've ever had in Britain. So it had been the old feudal lords, but by buying these little plots of land and their own homes around the country, people have actually bought a bit of Britain. I mean, the idea is if you're British or if you're English, you've got a bit of Britain that's your own, or you've got a bit of England, which is your own, which it seems to me is a basic right. It's a deal. If you're going to have a government, that's working for you, then you've got to have your own stake, a literal stake in the country that you're supposed to be supporting and part of.
Okay, well, you're right. I slightly misrepresented what you said. Fair play. Because in places like Germany, a lot of people do rent and they don't mind. You're saying a lot of people should own. Everyone should own, but it shouldn't be at the prices that we have now. It's still a revolution, though, Tony, because with 75 million people living in the UK now, that's a lot of property you need, and there's probably shortage, and demand and supply means that you need to have a command economy. You need to intervene on the market because the prices are set by the market at the moment.
Well, yes, you're right. And the market has failed. That's the problem. We've got here in Bristol, we've got 25,000 people on the housing waiting list, even, who are in insecure accommodation of one sort or another. And we've got a massive explosion in travellers, for example. So we've got people living in vans up on the Downs in Clifton here, 4 times more than there were just a couple of years ago, because people cannot afford to live. It's as simple as that. And the social housing is very, very limited. The council and the housing associations are building hardly anything. So we've got a population explosion, which is partly fueled by I'm not sure how many migrants we've got, 700,000 net coming in every year into Britain. Fueled by that, you've got a property bubble, and yet we've got, literally hundreds of thousands of people living in things like canal boats and vans, tents even, because they just can't get anywhere to live. So I think solving the housing crisis, literally solving it rather than papering it over, would make a massive, massive difference. And that, to me, it just means that you've got a more kind of confident, sensible country when people are not under threat of eviction. Then they are actually free. All the time you're thinking, well, actually, if I don't do what the boss says, in 2 weeks' time I could be defaulting on my mortgage or my rent. This is a horrific state to be in. And it's one of the reasons, as I was saying earlier, that the West has failed on the international stage, to be able to compete with other countries, is because we're obsessed by the fact that they're not making any more land. And so this has become a speculative market, which doesn't really regard human beings as human. They're just commodities to be booted out because they're not paying enough rent. So if you can't pay the rent increase, we've got to cure people who can. So off you go. This is very inhuman, and I think we need to just. I wouldn't say revolution. I think a policy like the sort of policies that the Labour Party brought in after World War II, in terms of a command economy on infrastructure. Then I think I think that would make an enormous positive difference. It's the sort of policy the Workers' Party of George Galloway are, which is old school Labour socialism. We're not talking about this kind of Fabian stuff at all, right? Which is the neoliberal economics kind of coming into the Labour Party. We're talking about the idea of a mixed economy where you balance private enterprise with the state controlling and owning infrastructure and actually literally caring for its population. And I think also, a kind of spiritual revival would be a good thing too.
Quite a dramatic turn of events here. You've more or less laid out a manifesto that could propel you to Downing Street. Let me read you some questions here, or comments. Mazzy says they didn't like that every family should have a home, social housing, unsafe builds, cut money from need, I say more. And lots of comments here. Holly has to go, but says she likes the show. Thanks very much indeed, Holly. This is just a bloke says, I can't give my money away to my eldest daughter. I offered to buy her a house for cash, but she'd rather have a mortgage. Hope she doesn't live to regret that, says just a bloke. Just one more. Travellers, who I have got a criminal record because of travellers. That's a subject I have lots of pickles about. Okay, I won't go into that too much now. And just one more eviction. Eviction is hanging over my head every day as soon as I can't pay. I lived in my rented council property now for 30 plus years. I'd say I own this flat with what I've paid over years. Moreover, I've never been in a financial position to do so and pay out. To see my patents go downhill. Well, it sounds to me a lot of people quite sympathetic there. We didn't really get to talking about common law today, and we won't. Just to summarise, because we've got to go in a minute or two. If you were to make a prognosis about this upcoming election, we've talked what conventional mainstream would say is a pretty radical agenda, that you wouldn't say so yourself. What do you think the next general election will be decided on? Or has it already been decided?
Yes, it's already been decided. I mean, the Labour Party is going to win. I heard this from an insider who's representative of the Civil Servants Union. The Conservatives don't want to win. And I suggest this is most probably because they know that there's economic woes and potentially